Welcome to another episode of This Was Supposed to Be Easy.
We've had these conversations on at least 1,000 car rides and thought it might be time for other people to join us. This is Cheryl.
And my name's Amy.
Amy, we are coming out of the weekend, and I thought we could start today by sharing something fun each of us did.
I love that idea. Actually, I had a great weekend. It was my birthday.
Woohoo!
Thank you. My sister and her husband made me an amazing dinner. My daughter, my oldest, she actually made me a really good dessert. She made 2 desserts, actually, which was the first one was a strawberry lemon blondie, and the next one was a cinnamon sugar blondie. So that was very cool and kind of out of her comfort zone because she is not a baker and she's actually very new to even in cooking and baking in general. And so it was something really special and really sweet that she decided to take that on as being new in the kitchen.
Ella might need to give her my congrats and address because now my mouth is watering.
Yes, yes. We'll have to do it for your birthday next month.
Yes. Ella, you have a personal invitation to come on over. I actually, as you were talking about Ella and what she did for you for your birthday, I was thinking about my own daughter and a phone call that I received from her. So she took a trip to New York to, who could guess it, see some Broadway
Please.
shows, right?
Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. And I got this crazy text from her. It just said, "Do you have time to talk?" And I said, "Sure." And she said, "Okay, I need 10 minutes." And then when we finally connected in that phone call, she was hyperventilating and sort of sobbing, like literally sobbing, and couldn't speak. And I was sort of getting terrified, right? I mean, I knew she was
Right.
able to text me and say, "I need 10 minutes" and all of that. But still, as it went on, I was like, at least tell me if this is a good or a bad hyperventilation situation that's happening right now.
Right.
And then what she told me sort of blew my socks off, and I think her socks have continued to be blown off. So when this girl was 12, I took her to the movie Mamma Mia, and that moment of watching that movie sort of turned her into an instant Meryl Streep fan. And you've got to remember, I said she was 12. So, she's an old soul. And I think when Mamma Mia came out on DVD, she kept track, as the future auditor in her would do. She kept track of watching it. And I think she watched it every single day for many months. I'm
Mhm.
pretty sure Mamma Mia was also the first national tour Broadway show that she went to as well. So anyway, there's lots of connections. But for me to say that she is the biggest Meryl Streep fan, I think anyone would have a hard time challenging that or proving that they might be bigger. Anyway, long story. I'm not sure if I can make it short. Right?
But I know it's going to be a good one. So
I
go
know,
right
I know,
ahead.
right? All of that to say that she was going to as many shows in New York City as she could possibly get to. And over the course of the years, she has attempted a few times to put herself in a place where there's a small chance Meryl might be. For example, in 2020, I believe that Meryl was supposed to host the Met Gala. And Taylor was going to go do the red carpet so that she might be on the sidewalk and see her walk by. And then the pandemic happened and the Met Gala did not. So that's just one example. But in this case, she was going to a small show in a theater that only holds 300 people, so pretty intimate, had nothing to do with Meryl Streep. She got there early, which Amy,
Yes, she is not an early bird. She is not an early bird at all.
no, she pretty much doesn't believe in arriving early
Right.
to the show, but she did get there early because she had never been to this theater before and wanted to make sure that nothing went wrong. And she also had a seat in the back row. And when she went to the bathroom before the show, she was in line with an actor that she recognized from previous shows. And so when she sat down in her back row in the round seat, she thought, "I'm going to see if I can figure out where her seat is because I can literally see everybody in this space." And so she was
Mhm.
scanning and she saw the actor and decided, oh, this is kind of cool. I'm just gonna keep scanning and watching and seeing, seeing who's here. There might be other famous people here. And side note, I don't even know if you know this, but Uma Thurman's son was in the show and she didn't realize it. So she also saw Uma Thurman
Oh,
later that day.
cool.
But she is sitting in this back row and Meryl Streep walked through the door and sat in the same row as her 10 people away.
So now, did she see any of the play, or did she only stare at Meryl the whole time?
It's funny because for many years, she was 12 when she fell in love with her, and she's 29 now. So, more than 15 years, she has had these not ideas. She has thought about what would I do? Like, what would I do if I was in the same place as Meryl Streep? How terrifying would it be if I actually had to have any kind of exchange with her? That totally terrifies her. And she's like, well, now I know the answer. The answer is, my whole body turned to stone. She literally sort of froze for a long time. But she made a Facebook post about this and how it was now the best day of her life. Someone asked her if she watched the show, much like you just asked.
Mhm.
And I think her answer was something like 50% of the time I was watching Meryl, and 25% of the time I was checking to see what her reactions were to things that were happening in the show. So, anyway, I could talk about it for a long time because I've talked with her about it for such a long time and multiple times in the last 2 days. But the idea, this fact that she was in the same place and sharing the same space as Meryl Streep was a really cool thing that happened to us this weekend. And when I say us, it's because I got to get the phone call when she was finally able to breathe.
Right.
But it does make me think about today's episode topic and conversations that we've had about it over time, because today's topic is much like Taylor felt when she was in the same place as Meryl Streep. The topic is for anyone who's ever thought, wait, who let me in here? Like, how did I get into this place? So I actually had this serendipitous moment a few weeks ago at our state early childhood conference where a friend was leading a 4-hour session on leadership and had asked quite a few people to stop by the room to share a piece of their story and answer questions that people who had selected that topic might want to ask. And it was interesting because, I've been in the profession for quite a long time and I've had quite a few roles. And so I didn't question the invitation to stop by the room to share my leadership story. I didn't even feel the need to prepare. Well, quite honestly, I didn't even feel the need to read the questions she sent me if I wanted to prepare. I just really, just was comfortable walking into the space and talking about whatever it was that was going to come about. And someone asked me a question that I wasn't ready for. And I really hadn't thought about or felt in the context of the early childhood world for quite some time. But it was a reminder that many, maybe most, maybe even all of us struggle with that question of, do I belong here? And we have those feelings that hit us at one point or another, sometimes all the time, sometimes completely unexpected. So,
Yeah. So, I mean, as our listeners can guess, what we're really talking today is about imposter syndrome. And it's one of those things that's kind of interesting because there's a lot of research, there's been a lot done on imposter syndrome, yet it still keeps coming up. And in this situation specifically, I was asked by someone who had listened to the podcast, when I said, "What episodes would you like to hear?" She mentioned this one specifically and said, "When are you gonna do an episode on imposter syndrome? I need that one." Having a few more conversations with other people and said, "Well, what do you think about imposter syndrome?" And everyone said, "Yes, I need more on that." And even though there is a lot out there, we can put the Amy and Cheryl spin on it as well.
Sure, sure. And yeah, so when this person stand up stood up in the room and asked me how I deal with imposter syndrome, which as you mentioned, someone had just asked you the same thing. I was taken aback for a quick minute because yes, I felt it many, many times. It wasn't a moment when I was thinking about it and wasn't necessarily prepared to answer it, but I've thought about it since. And what is that sense of imposter syndrome and how do you describe it or define it? And really it's sort of that sneaky feeling that you're not good enough, often even when you are, right? I think there are these moments in time that we doubt our skills. We even doubt actual accomplishments that we've had. I think, we've been told to fake it till you make it. And I think sometimes we worry that we're still faking it, that leads to that I'm an imposter in this place. Or we think that our success, if we're feeling that in the moment is due to luck, blame that on timing. How many times have you said, oh, I was just lucky too, instead of actually, taking a little credit
Mhm.
for the thing that you did. And we brush off our own talents and our own hard work often to just give that away to saying it's luck. Here's the kicker. When I think about imposter syndrome, I don't think that it shows up because we're failing at something. It doesn't show up because we're not good enough. Actually shows up when we're growing, right? Because those are those moments when we're trying something new, when we're trying something that's a little harder than what we've been successful at or have grown to a point where it's easy to accomplish. And so when stuff feels bigger than what we're used to, it sneaks up on us. But I think it's because we're actually growing. And sometimes we don't feel like we deserve the success, but sometimes you feel like you don't deserve a success that you've achieved. But I think even more often it sneaks up on us when we feel like we shouldn't even be in the room or we question how we even got to be a voice at the table. And we very recently had that podcast episode where we talked about the Wahasu and the Women's Summit. And we talked about a board of directors and choosing to be around people and surround ourselves with people that we want to be more like. And having that board of directors be the people who can bring our name to the table. And so we can't necessarily work towards that and then constantly question whether we're being an imposter. Not even sure if that makes sense, but
Yeah, I think that it does. I think what really happens is that we get in our own heads, right? We start thinking of all the things we're not instead of what we are. And so when we start putting our name next to those things that we somehow feel we aren't, we come up as lacking instead of all the amazing things that make us who we are and
yeah.
make
And
us up.
Amy, when I think about it, I think about sometimes the fact that we feel like an imposter in very regular roles that we participate in. I think of myself as a parent, especially as I just was thinking about that phone call with my daughter. And my daughter's 29 years old. Okay, I've been a parent for a long time, but there were so many times when they were teenagers, college students, and young adults, especially, that I would realize, my gosh, I did this. I parented young children and school children. And I wonder how they view me as a parent in comparison to how I viewed my own parents when I was that age. And so I just have never thought of myself as a parent, even in the same way that I saw my own parents when they were participating in these same roles. It's probably a kind of a crazy way to share that, but just to say, even things we do really well, things we do all the time, it still sneaks in on us and offers those moments of us questioning am I doing it as good as this other person did it? People can't necessarily see you like I can see you right now in the thinking that you're doing, but I'm going to throw a question at you and then just see what was percolating in your mind right there.
Yeah.
To just say, here we are talking to each other on a podcast, and I'm going to ask you if you've actually allowed yourself to say, I am a podcaster.
Yeah, and the answer is no. And it's so interesting that you asked me that question specifically because there are a lot of times in my life I know I have felt like an imposter and then I've done things and I've overcome them. I don't feel that way. And so to be back in this situation of feeling like an imposter, I mean, I remember it was probably more than 9 months ago when I approached you. We were sitting at a restaurant or a bar and I said like, "Hey, I think we should do this podcast." And I've been thinking more and more about it, and we've thrown it out as like a kind of a fun what if one day we do this? What if we actually really start thinking about it and really make plannable steps?
Mm-hmm.
And now we're more than 10 episodes out and I haven't added it to my LinkedIn page of saying, even though I'm gonna do that. That's gonna be my goal for this week. But, I haven't labeled myself as a podcaster. I've occasionally looked at going to some of the conferences, but I've even thought going to the conferences like, "Oh, am I enough of a podcaster? Like, can I put that label on myself to actually be there with other people too?" But again, it all comes down to that comparison piece. I'm comparing my success and my ability to do something with how well somebody else has done it. It's a really tough place to be in when you start doing it. But the other thing that's interesting about imposter syndrome is it doesn't necessarily show up in the exact same way for every person. When I was kind of doing some research and looking at the different types of imposter syndrome or what imposter syndrome was, I noticed these different types and they resonated with me so much that I thought, okay, I have to bring this to the show because I think other people will feel this way too.
Yeah.
So I'm going to kind of be really specific here, but I want you as the listener to think which one of these, if you're experiencing imposter syndrome, which kind of specific kind do you feel like you're having? And so the first one is the perfectionist. And just as it says, you can never make that mistake. Anything less than perfect is total failure, and
Mhm.
we all know people that are like that. If I can't do imperfect, then I can't. I'm not doing it. Or if you're reading the reviews and you're reading the reviews on something and 95 or 99% of the people love what you're doing and then one person writes some type of scathing review, you can only remember what that one person said and clearly you define yourself by that one person versus all the other people that said you did something amazing. The next one is the expert. And that expert is very similar to the perfectionist, but it's that you have to know everything before you can call yourself legit. And I think that's really where I'm at with this podcast right now. I mean, the amount of times that I have listened to other people's podcasts of how to create a podcast, or I've read the books and I've done the things and I've met with coaches and all of the things to do this. Yet since I can't call myself an expert, I don't know everything about everything when it comes to this. I'm feeling a little bit like, oh, I'm a fraud somehow.
Mhm.
The next one is the soloist, and that's thinking that you have to do everything by yourself.
I feel this one.
Do you? It's one that I think a lot of people do, and it actually comes from not necessarily having people that you could rely on in the past. And so with this one, when you're looking at it, you have to somehow prove that you belong and that you have a seat at the table. We talk a lot about seats at the table and things like that. And it's that you have to prove it to make sure that people know that you're good enough.
Mhm.
And then that next one is the natural genius. And that is that you believe if something doesn't come easily or immediately, then you're not truly talented. And again, you go back to feeling like a fraud. And I know with my own daughter, I've watched this one with her. She's had some really natural abilities throughout her life and she's done well at them. But for certain things, she's like, "Oh, I think I might like to try it." But if she doesn't have a natural inclination, she's like, "Nope, I'm out. I'm done, and leads towards the things that are easier. And I think a lot of people do this one too. And so I would suggest to tell people commit to a time frame. Say that, okay, you know what? No matter the outcome, I'm going to do this thing I'm going to do it at least 5 times and then reassess. What is it that you were doing? And if after 5 times you're still not enjoying it or you're still terrible or you're still whatever, then maybe give yourself 5 more times. But don't consider yourself a fraud right away because again, you're new. You're new at it.
It reminds me of that statistic, and I'm not going to remember it right now, but, the 10,000 hours or something like that,
Yes.
right? Like you can become an expert or, have this skill if you just dedicate 10,000 hours to it. And that idea that it should be in the first hour, it should feel like that is
Yes.
what you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing and it goes again back to comparison. So, of my 3 children, my middle child is very naturally artistic. And I remember the other two saying they didn't feel comfortable calling themselves an artist or being good at art in some way because they were comparing themselves to their brother, who is very naturally talented. But he's also because he enjoys it, he's put in a lot of work for it.
Mm,
And so the other 2 were like, "Oh, I can't like it. That's Mitchell's thing. That's our brother's thing. We can't like it too." And it's that weird mind piece that like, yeah, you could all be great at it. You could all be great at it in different ways.
yeah, yeah.
And so that looks different. And then the last one is the superhuman. You push
Mhm.
yourself to work harder, longer, better, everyone around you to prove that you are not the imposter. The problem with this one is you often burn yourself out. You burn
Yeah.
yourself out on what you're doing, you burn yourself out on the way that you think it should be done. Because you're doing it so much, you're not doing it in a joyful way oftentimes. You're doing it to cross the finish line. You're doing it to say I am a type of a thing. And so when you do that, you lose the joy, you lose the specialness, you lose the kind of journey with it because you're just trying to get to the end.
It makes me think that also that superhuman moves beyond the joy and probably also into the resentment, resenting
Mm.
others who aren't making that same push and effort.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Right. Because if everybody else looks like they're having fun while doing it and you can't, then, well, why aren't you having fun?
Yeah. Grumpy pants.
Mhm. Yeah, if you're listening and any of these resonate with you, think about it. Think about which one does and maybe pay attention as we talk about, so what does that look like?
So, Amy, it's as I think about imposter syndrome, we have talked about what it is and what types might sneak in depending on who you are, or maybe several of them felt familiar and you wanted to raise your hand and shout out like I kind of did a couple of times. It sneaks in I don't know, I think some common time periods of our life, of our existence. And I think it would help our listeners if we gave a few examples of when it might sneak in and what that might look like so that we can talk about what to do about it. And not just you and I, Amy, but even to learn from others. And so I think one of the biggest times that I have felt imposter syndrome sneak in is when I am trying something new for the first time or within that new phase of trying something.
Yeah, I feel like this year has been a big year for new things for me with the podcast. And I might have mentioned before, but I went back to school. And so I'm working on a doctorate program right now. I'm doing a doctorate in IO psychology, which, as you all have listened to me over the last few podcasts, you know that my background is early childhood. And so though I've done some leadership, I have done, a very basic psychology program. This is different. And somebody had said something to me about being a psychologist. And I remember, even though I'm going through this whole program, and we'll be taking all these classes and doing all of these things as I'm kind of ending my first semester. The idea of calling myself a psychologist felt completely bizarre. I almost thought to myself, "Ooh, do I have the right to do that? Like, is that okay? Like, am I going to be able to have that label?" And because I've never worn it before or I've never had it before, it felt weird. And as I've
Mhm.
been taking some of these new classes, like I'm taking statistics and research methods and a lot more business type classes, and they're all a little bit of a stretch for me, I immediately wanted to have some of that negative talk of, "Oh, I don't belong here. This isn't the program," even though it is, and I know I can, but I was new. I've been new at it, and it's definitely brought up some doubts.
As you say that, I remember when I was taking my applied positive psychology work course that I participated in a few years ago. One thing I really appreciated was that the leaders and designers of the program gave us the language to use, I think to help with the imposter syndrome, right? And so this was not a doctoral program. It wasn't a master's program. It was an outside of a credit bearing type of program. And so it wasn't a circumstance where we could walk out and say, I'm a psychologist, right?
Mm,
So instead, they were very clear to say what you can call yourself is an applied positive psychology practitioner. It was really helpful with that feeling of imposter syndrome, as well as to do it appropriately and correctly to say, this is what you can call yourself. And so, Amy, I'm sitting here right now saying, you're trying something new and you are in the throes of it for sure. In the near future, you will get to call yourself a psychologist.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
it'll be weird up until the day I do it,
yeah,
right?
yeah, but you'll get there and we'll all celebrate. We'll give you like a little nameplate or a placard or something that, has that. Another scenario I find is in mentoring others, right? So in a case where it sneaks in because not only am I supposed to think of myself as having these skills, but now I'm supposed to help someone else who's maybe newer in whatever the area is. And I know as a faculty member at the university, whenever we bring in new faculty members, it's an expectation that someone in the department takes on that mentorship responsibility so that everyone who's new has someone who's been through all the stages that exist when it comes to working towards tenure as a faculty member. And so over the course of time, I've had multiple people as my mentees in that role, but I often don't think of myself as an academic, right? I've sat in a room and said, I'm a practitioner. I'm not an academic as much as all the other people here. Who do I think I am? And I think that then bleeds through into mentoring others. And so multiple times I've worked for a year, for 2 years in supporting someone else and mentoring them, and this is something that, if you're bean counting, actually counts when you yourself are going up for promotion or for something like that. But I wasn't putting it on my Vita because
Mm.
I didn't feel like I did it as good as someone else had done it, or I didn't do it well enough, or what might that person say, like you weren't a great mentor. I had all of these questions circling around in my head about whether I did it good enough, which I think is a whole nother thing. We probably will need to talk about as we go through imposter syndrome, but definitely when mentoring others, it has snuck up on me. Another example, when stepping up at work, stepping up often means it is a newer piece for you, or you're taking on more while you're doing other things. And I'll never forget the time period when we were designing a new space for our early childhood laboratory preschool program. And the building was, this was a multi-year process. The building was in the design phases. And we had many short meetings over the course of time with architects and interior designers. And I had to advocate for a very specific aesthetic in the space that we were looking for. And at the same time, I was talking to people whose entire job was to design space and to be an architect, but they didn't necessarily know early childhood and they didn't know the aesthetic that we were trying to create inside of our space. And so I kept having to juggle this pathway and navigate, how do I step up into this role of advocating with people who are experts in this topic, but not in my topic of early childhood and the passions and what I'm looking for. So when we're stepping up to do something, I feel like it sneaks in then.
I think you're right. And, I heard two big topics that I feel like I kind of need to come back to. One, again, that comparison piece,
Mm,
because we don't really feel imposter syndrome. It only really exists because we compare ourselves to either someone else or we compare ourselves to an imagined thought of what it should be. And so when we do that, we experience some type of stress or like we're not measuring up because somebody else did it better, or we think it should be done better. And then we
mhm.
sit there and we think, oh, if only, or I should do this, or I would have wanted to do it this way. But it really makes me think, as you're taught, the second part kind of that goes along with that, that what you're talking about is almost that content area of expertise. You were using the piece when you were talking about the art, working with the architects and the designs. They have one set of skills where they are the expert, but
Mhm.
you had another set of skills where you were the expert. That project would not happen if you both didn't bring your set of skills to it, but you were comparing yourself to the wrong set of skills. You were new in that set. You weren't new in the area that you were meant to be in. So you were comparing yourself in a lane that you were never meant to be in. That's why you had the other group there. So when you're thinking about that, I think that if you can think, our listeners, if you can think about the areas that you are meant to be in and the skills that you have, I bet you would find yourself much more ahead of the curve than you think you are behind. But I have to imagine that you're comparing yourself to the wrong lane. You're
Oof.
comparing yourself to people who are not in your lane. You're looking at people who have their own skill set and their own, what was it, the 10,000 hours of expertise. And the other thing that I think is so important with this is I mentioned it. You can't be all things to all things. You can't be all things to every person. And if let's say we have 10,000 hours, then you gave your 10,000 hours to what you've given it to over the course of your life. And so it's almost like that bucket system, or even I think of it as like, you have to make a budget. So if I give you, let's say I give you $100 at the end of the week, even at the start of the week, let's say, and say you can spend your $100 in any way. How are you going to spend those $100? You're going to spend it on your values. You're going to spend it on what's important to you. But if you start looking at what other people bought with their $100 and then you think yours isn't as good,
Mm.
well, then you need to look at your values. Then you need to look at how you did spend your time and your effort and your energy. And so if you are sitting here right now thinking that you're somehow not enough, are you living within your values, which we've asked numerous times? Are you living within your values? And if not, maybe that's the bigger question over whether you're being an imposter.
Wow. Building on what you said about comparison, Amy, it really gets me thinking about where that feeling of being imposter actually comes from, because it's so common, especially when we're stepping outside of our comfort zone.
I think it's that ability to tie into human tendency where we compare our inside thoughts into what we perceive or what we think we're seeing to somebody's kind of outside actuality. Like it makes me think about a time that I had a friend who commented on how confident I was. And though many times I am confident, in that moment, I was not. And I just remember thinking, like, well, I'm happy I can fake it because I am not confident when it comes to this. And she's like, I never would have guessed that. I would have thought that you were confident all of the time. And it was just kind of that eye-opening thing for me in that moment to say like, "Oh, well, I'm happy that I could put that through, but, just so you know, not really." Where I wonder how many other times I think when I'm kind of doing that whole comparative piece that somebody else has it all together where because that's what they put out, but inside they might be falling apart or feel like they don't have it all together.
Yeah, I think that's the benefit of surrounding yourself with people who can honestly give you some of that feedback sometimes, because I also have had people say to me when I've began a sentence with a negative statement about myself, before I share my thoughts, and I've had people literally look at me and say, "That's not true, Cheryl, and you shouldn't say that about yourself." And really appreciate that when I'm in a safe space for someone to be able to say that to me. I also can hear one of our friends in the back of my head catching me every time I say I'm sorry
Mm.
and wondering if the societal factors, the way we were brought up, and when I say we right now, I'm really thinking about women and how often we say sorry. And I think that women specifically are often conditioned or socialized to apologize all the time. Like we'll say sorry even when we had absolutely nothing to do with it. And sometimes when I catch myself and I hear myself doing that now, I'm realizing that it's almost lowering who I am or, my self-esteem. And it must embed in our mindset in some way that view of ourselves that we aren't enough, which then when we find the bravery and find the power to try something new, it allows that imposter syndrome to be there.
I remember in my teens and 20s, I think I apologized almost every other word that came out of my mouth to the point where I would have people say, "Stop apologizing." Like it would, and then I would apologize for apologizing, right? "Oh,
Yeah.
so sorry," but, and I don't even know what I was apologizing for. I think at some point, I think I was apologizing for just for taking up space. And now as I'm past that, I don't do it as often. And I like myself more because of it.
Yeah, yeah. So I hear myself saying it sometimes, or I hear other people saying it, and just think, wow, what's happening with that thought process, and is there a bit of imposter feeling happening inside? So maybe it's not so important to think about or know about where it comes from, when the real work is probably in thinking about what to do with it. We just talked about practicing not saying I'm sorry. And I'm not going to lie, we took a pause a minute ago, and Amy's husband walked through the room and mentioned that he had read in a book that, I'm going to say the original person, but I cannot verify that in the moment, never really thought of it as a syndrome. They talked about it as imposter phenomenon. And we paused and we asked him what that reason was, in the reading. And he said, because often when you think about a syndrome, it's permanent and something that you always have. And with imposter phenomenon, it's overcomable. It's something that you can work on and work towards. And I really, really, really like sitting here thinking about that and wanting to take a few minutes to talk about what we could try to overcome.
Right. I think there are a lot of things that we can do to start that change. I think the first thing is naming that voice. So, Blanche, Tony, whatever you want to name it, give it a name that means something to you. And every time that imposter syndrome that you're not good enough starts creeping in. So, Blanche, shut up. You're not welcome here right now. But, give it that voice, name it, know what it is, tell it to be quiet. I like the line, go home, you're drunk. Like those types of things. Like, tell it to just get out of your head.
I like it. I'm gonna think hard on that name, and it's gonna have a name going forward for sure. When I think back to the saying I'm sorry a lot and over apologizing, I've been practicing ways to flip that language, and I think that that is a strategy that could help us with imposter syndrome. So, when we think about flipping the language, we aren't always wrong, so we aren't always an imposter. We aren't always faking it. We do have skills. We do have knowledge. We do have things to bring to the table. So when we're feeling maybe a little bit less and we need to say something, maybe changing that phrasing to something like, thanks for your patience, instead of, I'm sorry I did, blah, blah, blah. Just thanks for your patience and then move forward without the apology.
Sorry, I was late. Yeah.
Yee, yes. Thanks for your patience. There was a this in front of me on the road. I don't know what that is. Another idea is to collect the receipts, if you could put that in air quotes. Keep a list of your wins, no matter how small they are. It doesn't have to be a public list. It can be something in a journal or in your own private space, but in a place where you can see it more often. So keep that list of your wins and make them visible to yourself, and they will speak to you. I think I used to have, well, as a faculty member, you have to prove a lot of things to get the next promotion. I used to have this thing called Keep My Job Box, and I hated it because literally I had to, I had to track everything I did, prove it with the email or the publication or the conference program, whatever it was, and put it in the box. And then every so many years, turn that in for everybody to get to look through. And I really just hated it because it felt like, number one, it felt like justifying everything. And sometimes it felt like bragging about something. And I was trained not to brag, but to be quiet about my accomplishments. But it did provide evidence to me that I was accomplishing things. And so I think about that too when I think about, collecting the receipts or listing your wins.
I like that.
Yeah. Also, talking back to that fear. So when you hear it rear its head and you've given it a name and you're slapping back at it, I like to just talk back as if I'm reminding myself that there is always a continuum of expertise, right? There's always going to be someone who's less experienced than me, and there's always going to be someone who knows more than me. I'm somewhere on that continuum. And if I wasn't ready to be in this moment at this time, I wouldn't be here. So, it's another way to think about talking back to the fear.
I to expand on what you're saying right there, it makes me really think about a reframing technique that I had learned. And, I had mentioned before in some of our previous episodes, I think I even mentioned it earlier about the switching from being bad at something to new at something. But then taking that one step further and thinking about, so if you're new at something, and then that you can make a change into whatever it is you wanna be, what are you going to do to make that change? So, thinking along the lines of, we often feel, or we might feel, imposter syndrome at a job, or especially when we want to apply for a job, something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
I always think about it when somebody says like, "Oh, that's my dream job," and I'll say, "Oh, are you gonna apply?" And someone will say, "No, I'm not ready yet," or "No, I'm not, I don't think it's the right time." And so my question then usually becomes, "Okay, so what are you going to do between today and the next time it becomes available so you will be ready to apply?" Because
Mhm.
you can get away with that once. I can buy into it that, you weren't ready once. But the next time, you really have to think about it. If it is your dream job, what steps do you need to take? Do you need to pick up a different skill? Do you need some leadership opportunities? What is it specifically you need? And then figure out a way to get it. Maybe it's having a conversation with a boss or a coworker or a colleague or somebody that you know. Another way to go about doing this that is really, really helpful is I kind of have an obsession with AI and learning all things AI, but taking your resume and putting it into any AI software and ask someone, and you can actually upload the job description as well and say, compare this resume to this job description and what are the lacking skills between the two.
Ooh,
And so it will build out for you, oh, well, it looks like you're missing this, this, and this. You might want to consider, and then you can ask it for actionable steps. And so in doing that, you don't have to keep the emotion because it's taking the emotion out of it and giving you some some frank steps to do that. But I would also say try. It's one of those things, and with it as well, knowing the people that are involved or knowing people that will give you honest feedback or also knowing people in general. So thinking about being on that continuum, being willing to admit that you are not the most knowledgeable person in the room and you don't have all of the information, but then thinking about or saying in an interview or saying to a boss, if you're feeling over your head and you don't have all the information, who would you recommend that I go to who might have more information that can help me complete this task? Or what skill do I need to be more knowledgeable in doing this job well? But being able to admit it really chops down that imposter syndrome as well, because when you have that imposter feel, it means because you believe you should have more. So by owning the fact that you only have what you have, it gives you that opportunity to say, I don't have it all. That's okay because I know where to go to get it.
and I really hear the coaching coming out in you when your question turns it back to the person with the feeling or with the, I don't think I have enough for my dream job yet, right? To say, well, what is next? What can you do? And now it's back in my court to do the things,
Mhm.
to think about it myself, to try the AI idea, whatever it is, to create that list myself so that I own it a little bit more.
Yeah, because that's empowering you too.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for coaching again today, Amy.
All right. So here's a question for everybody who's listening. If you believed you belonged, what would you do differently this week? So, thinking about all the ways that you might be feeling that imposter feeling, if you believed you belonged, what would you do differently this week?
I want to give a great big shout out to Dr. Jeremy Bond for walking through the room. And since he's come through, we've used the word syndrome less and added the word feeling more and phenomenon more. So I'm already thinking about some of those different things and incorporating different language, even, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right away. Amy and I have been talking a lot about creating this bigger community with you, our listeners, and offering those invitations for you to share more of your thoughts with us, to ask some of your questions to us. And we're really working on that because we want our podcasts and these episodes to meet your ideas and your interests and what you're looking for. And so today, one of the invitations that we would like to offer is to ask you if you would be willing to DM us or use the comment features to share some of your imposter moments in terms of helping us think about where and when it rears its ugly head, and also some of the strategies that you have used in those moments. Because it was that question for both Amy and I when someone said to us, will you please talk about imposter syndrome? Or what do you do when you feel imposter syndrome? And so we're all about the strategies. And we know we don't have all the answers because we're on the continuum too. And so please think about sharing those moments and strategies with us. And we will very likely in the near future start to be able to read your thoughts, your ideas, your comments, and even some of your questions inside of our future episodes. And with that, Amy, I think it's time to wrap up today's episode.
Thanks for tuning in to This Was Supposed to Be Easy. Remember, the best stories are the ones we live.
Join us next time as we uncover more tales and thoughts that just might change your world while we navigate those things that we didn't expect to be so hard.
Stay curious, stay connected, and keep wondering.